I'd like to ask about the French reception. I realize you couldn't discuss everybody, but some of us here believe that one of the great French historians of American philosophy was the student of Jean-Paul Girard de la Dalle, who recently died. And as Randy Oxier can tell you more than I, for instance, we're very anxious that his big book on Dewey be published, and many of us were good friends of his. And I wonder whether you could say a bit about de la Dalle's work.
Yes, thank you. I didn't mention de la Dalle because I was more concerned with James and Royce here, but his influence in France on the Prussian scholarship and on the study of Dewey is tremendous. He worked with Dewey at Columbia, and he wrote really the first books in French. He translated logic, the theory of inquiry, and he wrote really many scholarly papers and made many introductions. And his history of American philosophy is still a major source to get acquainted with American philosophy. In the first version, there was a foreword, a preface by Jean Val, where there was this phrase about Dewey systems with the buildings and the skyline, but yes, it's an important influence, and we miss him a lot.
Thank you. There's James Luduslovski letters at Yale, and they suggest there that Luduslovski met James while he was traveling to the World Parliament of Religions in 1893, because he was a disciple of Vivekananda. And he wanted to stop by and see James's laboratory, and James accommodated him, and they struck up a friendship from there. And he would come to Cambridge and stay as a guest for a number of years until Mrs. James kicked him out of the house for doing nude yoga on the balcony in Cambridge.
I don't have anything nearly as entertaining as that to add. I would ask a couple questions about France, though. When the name of Fred Fouillet ever appears in your work. He was the author of about 30 books in philosophy and was responsible for the concept of the idée fausse, which both he and James saw as quite similar to James's pragmatism. But he seems to have disappeared from the scene in France, and I'm curious whether you've come across him at all. It looks as though the answer is no. The second name is Durkheim.
Sorry?
Emile Durkheim.
Durkheim, yes.
Yeah, in Hans Joas's work, he's credited with being responsible for much of the misinterpretation of pragmatism in France, and I was struck by the fact that you didn't mention him. I wondered if you had anything to say about his role. And in relation to Germany, it seems to me as though many of the developments you described are similar to developments in the United States. The marginalizing of phenomenology, of interpretive social science, the fascination with scientism, which many of us consider reductionist. I was heartened by the suggestion that these things are changing in Germany, but I'm wondering whether that's more wishful thinking than anything else. Do you see clear evidence of a shift away from those developments? And if so, could you tell us more about them? And I'll be hopeful that the people in the concluding session today can address some of these either parallels or disjunctions too. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. As regards Fouillet and also Delboeuf, if we think of the other French-speaking philosophers, there are no scholarship right now on these thinkers, except maybe by people who are very interested with Renouvier. I'm thinking of Laurent Fédy in France, who wrote a comprehensive book on Renouvier, which is a very fine study. And yeah, I think there really should be something. You know, I had really to mention a few landmarks, but on the quarrel over determinism and indeterminism, Fouillet, Delboeuf were important references for James, important correspondence, and he even urged Peirce to send them his papers from the monist in 1891-93, at least to Fouillet and Delboeuf. So there were important references at the time, and they totally vanished. And as regards Durkheim's famous lecture, I think the most considered view today is they address more a caricature of James than the real James, and I think it should be read within the context of what I mentioned. No many texts were translated at that time, and we didn't get into much detail about Schiller and Papini, but at that time it was really difficult to discuss pragmatism without involving the claims of these other thinkers who are often much more radical than James. So I guess that Durkheim was facing something like a complex involving James, but also these other thinkers. So.
As far as Germany and your question concerned phenomenology and what I call the so-called new phenomenology by Waldenfels and Fellmann and others, your question was whether this is more or less wishful thinking, whether this tradition is still alive. I think there are at least two contexts in which it is still important. The first one is maybe unexpected. It is kind of applied ethics, like neuroethics, because people need a complementary perspective on neurology that explains us how we are in terms of the brain sciences. And we have, of course, to consider qualitative consciousness as well. And this is where people, Mathias mentioned this before, sometimes refer to William James and his notion of subjective consciousness, and also bringing in the body again into philosophy. It's a major issue in German philosophy. What is embodiment? What does it mean? What are the rights, the property rights concerning our body? This might be a little bit unexpected, but we have many discussions going on in applied ethics concerning these issues. The second realm is phenomenology of religion. This is where William James's varieties, of course, are still alive. And I want to mention that there are some conferences going on his pragmatism, of course, right this year to celebrate the birthday of his pragmatism lectures. So James is not forgotten.
Question right here in the middle. And maybe somebody can reach that over to.
Concerning the German reception of pragmatism, of course, with Kant, you have a pragmatic anthropology that consciously distinguished itself from the physiological approaches that Plotner and other Germans were advocating. And if I recall, other Germans, such as Christian Wolff and Baumgarten, were using this term pragmatism even before Kant. And have any German scholars picked up on this pragmatic element in earlier German philosophy?
I think that Klaus Oehler has done some work on this, and also combining unexpected as this may be with Aristotle and the notion of pragma and the focus on the Lebenswelt in this context.
And just behind that previous questioner.
My question is for Mathias. When I read Gabriel Marcel, my take on it had been that he was largely influenced by Carl Gustav Jung. So I'm very surprised to hear that he also was influenced by James and Royce. Can you talk a little bit more about how his conception of universal unconscious or subconscious may have been influenced by Royce or James?
So, yes, in fact, Marcel's book on Royce, La métaphysique de Royce, Royce's Metaphysics, is made from these 4 papers. These are very long papers in Revue de Métaphysique, and he addresses every problem in Royce's philosophy at that time. And later, in his last text, he tended to qualify Royce's influence on his thought. He seem to think that Hocking, for example, was a major influence, or even Bradley had more influence on him than Royce. Still, this was widely read. For Marcel had many readers, and this was a main source. And a study that is, I'm not acquainted with detailed studies of the use made by Marcel in his Journal Métaphysique. It's a kind of metaphysical diary, and there are many uses of Royce, and it's just a pity that the last editions of the book don't include still today a real index. And I think that would be very useful in the scholarship. So, as regards to more general question, I guess we should have to put other thinkers into in the picture. But he was really interested in Royce's metaphysical system.
Time for one more question. Front and center there.
I'm very intrigued by the comments about the latent possible tendencies of an imperialist philosophy, which can be construed as being maybe a kind of colonialism or tendencies towards empire. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, as we all know, William James was an ardent anti-imperialist, and it is somehow striking that people mistook his philosophy in line with capitalism. So, because we all know that his heart was with the underdogs, with the suppressed. So, I think it was more the idea that pragmatism had something to do with capitalism. As I said before, think of the cash value metaphor, and that it stems from a country of salesmen. So this was a very primitive and blunt misunderstanding, for which I still feel a little bit guilty for. But I think this was the line of thought on which this is based.
Thank you very much to our panelists and to the questioners. Maybe just a quick round of applause and a stretch.